In this new video, I will deal with the beginning of the first lesson of History Theme 3. History Theme 3 is about the birth of the modern state. One thing is sure is that the early modern times politically was clearly the era of the power of kings. And it's in this context that the roots of the state as we know it today was born. In a way, we could say that politically the Middle Ages was the era of lords and the power of the church, maybe in Europe, that the 19th century and 20th was the era of nations, and so early modern times was maybe the era of kings. And what is interesting with Theme 3 is that in the new French syllabus we must study this topic with a comparison between a French way of building the state and then a British way. And so this lesson 1, will be about the assertion of the state in France from the 16th to the 18th century. By assertion, we mean that the state imposed itself to the people and the other institutions of the countries. Okay, but it's important to define what a state is, isn't it? So a state is a political entity, and one thing I often like to say is that entity is the scientific word to say a thing. So a state is a political entity that is composed of three things: a territory, so a territory is defined by its borders; a population, there must be a population on this territory; and a sovereign power that rules over this territory and this population. That's the reason why we would not say that a region like Nouvelle-Aquitaine today is a state, because the power of the region Nouvelle-Aquitaine is not sovereign. There is something above it, which is the national state of France. So you have a state when you have these three components. And in the two lessons, the one in France today and the one about Britain later, we will have a focus on the fact that the process of building the modern state generated tensions and conflicts. So in France, and this would also be true of Britain, the political actors since the Middle Ages almost all belonged to a social class that we call the nobility. You can see them on the left on this picture, this miniature, which represents a meeting of the king and the other political actors of the kingdom. The nobility represented less than 2% of the population, but it had all the power and shared it in a way with another group called the clergy, which means the Catholic Church in France. And the king progressively imposed itself as a coordinator and a ruler. But on such an image here, you have all the political actors of France in history up to the early modern times. What I mean is that you must take it for a fact that the people of those days, the people that had power, they really knew that they were an elite of 2 or 3% of the population, and they admitted as a fact that the vast majority of the population, the 97 remaining percent, had no influence at all, and they believed they would never have this influence. So when dealing about the state in early modern times, we will very rarely deal with the common people, because they were almost totally absent of the conception of politics. By the way, it may be important to define what politics is. Politics is all the relations that can exist in a society which are based around one major question, which is who governs. Okay, and politics is all the relations that try to give an answer to this question: who governs and how. So here you have the king, the nobility, and the clergy, and the main pattern that has structured the political history of the building of the modern state is that it has been a long conflict between the king and the other powerful actors of the state, and in fact mostly the nobility, because the nobility did not really accept the growing power of the king during the early modern times, which is one of the things we will often see in this lesson. Now, part 1 is called the birth of a modern state. I chose a chronological plan for this lesson. So I will deal with the long period, the century, stretching from 1515 to 1610 approximately. I will justify why. My first point will be about, yes, actually the building of a stronger kingdom under the reigns of King Francis I, so known as François Ier in French. We say Francis in English and at the international level, and his successor Henry II. Okay, so my first point is about the fact that under their reigns, it was the beginning of a centralized state. What is a centralized state? A centralized state is when all the important decisions are made by the state only, leaving only a very low autonomy to all levels of power. If I take some examples from the present times, France is still largely a centralized power, while countries like the United States of America or Germany are states which leave much more power to the regions, no matter what you call them. This is the reason why we say that the USA or Germany today are federal states. But France is still largely, if not totally, a centralized state. It basically means that most important decisions are taken from Paris and by a limited number of people. Well, in France, the root of this centralized state, the centralization of the state, is the early modern times. And Francis I in particular was the builder of this modern state, in the sense that he broke up with the medieval way of governing that was based on what we call the feudal system. So I need to say a few words about the Middle Ages and the political pattern that used to exist in Europe, in most areas of Europe at that moment. So that is a chart that is about Britain, but the system was more or less the same in France. During most of the Middle Ages, power was something very personal, and because the means of communication and transport and exchanges was not satisfactory, well, power used to be divided at different scales. It was almost impossible for one ruler, for a king, to actually have a good control of what was happening in his kingdom. That's the reason why the power of lords, in French les seigneurs, at a more regional or local scale was in fact more important. Lords could be named barons, like on this chart, or dukes or anything. They mostly belong to the nobility. Churchmen could also be lords. But they had in practice more power together than the kings. The power of kings was rather low in the Middle Ages. They really had to keep good relations with their barons. And so the whole political structure was a complex network of relations of power between lords, kings, down to the common people, the peasants, who had absolutely no influence at all. Each lord had a certain power over an area that we called a manor, that could be large or small, and the lords used to own, to possess their manor, and they ruled over it, raising taxes, dealing with justice, etc. So in practice, throughout the Middle Ages, the nobility, the lords, had a great autonomy. And so in those days, the definition of what a kingdom was not very clear. A kingdom was not really a given territory, because the boundaries, the borders of this kingdom were not clear. The law on a kingdom was not the same everywhere. And so politics was more a question of relationship between peoples of power than a question of strict administration and permanent law, etc. So the key issue, the most important problem that kings had to deal with if they wanted to build a more modern state was to provide their kingdom with a greater unity. Indeed, the law was not the same everywhere. I said that, notably regarding taxation, for example, or justice. And so giving more unity to a state could only mean a greater power for the king, so less power for the nobility. And that is the reason why there was a risk of conflict, and conflicts between nobles and the king often happened. So I said Francis I played a key role in imposing more unity to his kingdom by giving it a stronger structure under his rule. One important thing is that on top of his administration, there was, under Francis I, what we call the King's Council. And it's the form of government that existed at that moment. We would call that a government today. What was new with Francis I was that he chose the members of his councils on the basis of their loyalty and also of their skills. Okay, he had to choose the people who had some skills. He used a lot of lawyers, for example, people that knew the law. And that was rather new because that was different from the feudal system, because during the feudal system he had only to deal with the lords that had always been there, the great families of the nobility. In the Renaissance, the king started to choose his own people whom he trusted. That was rather new. We can see here another miniature showing King François I in a very medieval way. You can see the fleur de lis, we would say lily flower in English, and the blue color, which are symbols of the French monarchy. They are the symbols of the French king. And around him are people that looked like churchmen, which they probably were, because churchmen were the most educated ones. But here they are employed as lawyers mostly. So that is the King's Council. So if we list the things that Francis I introduced in the state of France, in addition to the King's Council, we must also say something about the fact that he was one of the first to create some kind of an administration for the kingdom, to send men that he trusted and send them on a permanent basis in his kingdom for administration, and not only rely on the lords. One thing that is absolutely essential to a state is the system of taxation. Taxation means that a state can impose the people to give some money, completely compulsory. And so what you can tax is the economic activity. You can tax people on the things they possess, for example. So this is a source of revenue, of income for a state. And Francis I was a king that improved the tax system in France, because he created the function of Minister of Finance. It was not really named this way in those days, but never mind. So somebody in charge of this administration. And he divided the Kingdom of France into 12 territories, originally named Généralités in France, which was a way of mapping France in order to raise taxes more efficiently and to collect them. One thing that is interesting about this Généralité, the map that we see here is more recent. It's about the 18th century, but never mind. Is that they were not all organized the same way. Some Généralités were called pays d'élection, and there the king had a direct control over taxation. He could impose what he wanted. In the most peripheral Généralités, that were called pays d'État, the local powerful people, so the lords basically, could meet together, and they had a say. They had something to say about taxation. The king had to be in agreement with them. So we can say that these peripheral provinces had more autonomy, a bit more independence in a way. So you see, the centralized state was only at its beginning, but it was not as centralized as today. And one last very important decision made by Francis I was that he tried to improve the judicial system in France. By judicial, we talk about the power of justice, one of the very important powers of the state, and so of the king in those days. One word about the powers, about the definition of the different powers. We basically consider three types of power today, three aspects of power. The legislative power, which is about making the law, writing it. The executive power, which is about enforcing the law, which, well, clearly means forcing the people to follow, to respect the law with the police, for example. And the judiciary, or judicial power, more often say judicial in English. And the judicial power is the power to interpret the law. Okay, this is why we have judges. We need judges, because interpreting the law, interpreting if one action made by somebody is a crime or not, is something that demands some reflection and debate. And so this is why we distinguish justice from executive power. If not, it's just a tyranny. So about the judicial system, there was an act called the Ordinance of Villers-Cotterêts. In French we say l'ordonnance. That's a name given to some kind of laws. And it was a key law of centralization. it tried to have a legal and judicial system that could be more easily understood by everybody. And the change that was introduced was that all the legal acts, all the legal texts, official texts in the kingdom should be written in French and not in Latin anymore. So this law is known to have accelerated the unification of language in France, okay? Because we started to write in French, and so the French language needed to have more strict grammatical rules. So it was the beginning of what we would call modern French. But one thing must be specified. In those days, the people in France did not speak the same language. One thing that you may know is that we have this traditional division of France between Languedoc in the northern part and Languedoc in the southern part. But you also have some very specific regional languages, like the language of Brittany, which was very different because it was not based on Latin at all. It was a Celtic kind of language. But anyway, at the local level, if you look at the map on the right, people used to speak extremely local languages that we would call patois a bit later. So in fact, this ordinance simply said that it was important that acts should be written in a language that people would understand. At the beginning, it was not written everywhere in the same French. Okay, the French of the south was not the same French as the French in the north, but progressively, thanks to this law, there was a unification of language, of written French, all over the state. And so for this reason, it is considered really a stepping stone, you see, a basis of the building of the centralized state in France. Another aspect of this ordinance, which is extremely important, is that it imposed that the Catholic Church should register all baptisms and burials. Baptism is the first sacrament. When a baby is born, is baptized. And so the name of the baby was written, registered, and who were his parents. This was already done before, but not systematically. Now, with this ordinance, it was absolutely compulsory. And so, thanks to this, the state could have a more accurate information about who were the French, actually, and who were the people under the rule of the king. And when people died, when they were buried, and burials, the Catholic Church also had to register. This is what we call the beginning of the system of vital record, état civil en français. Extremely important in the building of the state. And the remark we can make is that it was not done directly by the administration of the king, but by the Catholic Church. That's a good example of how in France the king and the Catholic Church often get along. They often got along well. There was a good alliance between the church and the king, which would not be the case in England, as you already know. Okay, so I will put an end to this first video, not to have it too long. And so in one next video, we will see that this centralization could not be total because the king had to deal with the remaining power of the nobles, and we will see how he tried to deal with that and to nevertheless improve his power thanks to some strategies.